She remembered before words existed, before language, before fire, before humanity knew it was human. The therapist asked her when she first came to Earth, and she went quiet for a long moment that stretched into something uncomfortable. Then she said something that made the room go cold, made Dr. Chun's hand pause over her notepad, made the air itself seem to hold its breath. I didn't come to Earth, I watched it be born. And what she described next changed everything they thought they knew about souls and consciousness and the nature of existence itself. Dr. Chen's office was dark except for one small lamp casting shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. Elizabeth sat in the worn leather chair, hands folded in her lap, breathing steady but somehow different from when she'd first arrived. She'd come for anxiety, for panic attacks that had no trigger, for a sense of not belonging that she'd carried her whole life like a stone in her chest. The regression had started like any other, with the familiar countdown, the gentle guidance to relax each muscle, to let go of the present moment and drift backward through time. But when Dr. Chen asked her to go back to her first lifetime, Elizabeth's breathing changed in a way that made the therapist's skin prickle with recognition of something she'd never encountered before. It got slower, deeper, like she was pulling air from somewhere far away, somewhere that existed outside the normal flow of time and space. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and Dr. Chen pulled her cardigan tighter, watching as Elizabeth's face transformed into something ancient and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the 60 years she'd lived in this body. When Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice came out different, older, carrying a weight of loneliness so profound it seemed to fill every corner of the room. "I'm watching," she said. And when Dr. Chen asked, "Watching what?" Elizabeth's answer was simple and impossible all at once. The beginning. Dr. Chun had studied consciousness for 20 years, had guided hundreds of people through past life regressions, had heard elaborate stories about ancient Egypt and medieval Europe, about being Cleopatra or Napoleon or nameless peasants who died in plagues. But this was different in a way that made her question everything she thought she knew about how regression worked, about what memories really were, about the nature of consciousness itself. Elizabeth wasn't claiming to be someone from history. She was claiming to be something else entirely, something that existed before history had even begun before. There were humans to record it before there was anything at all except water and storms. And the slow, patient work of a planet preparing itself for life. Elizabeth described it in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own throat, painting images of a world covered in deep blue water, darker and richer than any ocean that existed now, with an atmosphere so thick and hot and poisonous that nothing could breathe it. Nothing could live in it. Nothing could survive except the planet itself, slowly cooling, slowly changing, slowly becoming something that might one day cradle consciousness in its arms. She described being there without being there, having awareness without form, perceiving everything at once without eyes or ears or any of the senses that humans take for granted. And she described the waiting, the endless patient waiting for something she couldn't name yet. Something she knew was coming, but could unpredict or control or hurry along, no matter how much she wanted to. Dr. Chen asked if she was alone in this watching, and Elizabeth's face changed, softening into something that looked like remembered companionship mixed with a loneliness so deep it seemed to have no bottom. "No," she said, "there are others, many others. We're all here together but separate, all watching our own sections of the planet, all waiting for the same thing without knowing exactly what we're waiting for. All connected by this shared purpose but isolated in our own awareness, unable to truly touch or know each other in any meaningful way." She described how they communicated without words, without sound, just through knowing, through shared understanding that passed between them like light through water. And she described how they could feel it, the potential gathering in the planet below them, the sense that something important was about to happen, something that had never happened quite this way before. Something worth watching, even if the watching took billions of years. Dr. Chen asked her to move forward in time, and Elizabeth's breathing quickened, her eyes moving rapidly behind closed lids, as if she was watching something play out at impossible speed. "The water changed," she said, "became less violent, the storms calmed, the temperature dropped, and in the deep dark places where heat still rose from vents in the ocean floor, something began, something so small she could barely perceive it. Something that wasn't quite alive in any way that would make sense later, but wasn't quite not alive either. It was chemistry becoming biology, the threshold moment where molecules arranged themselves in patterns that could copy themselves, that could change, that could evolve into something more complex. And watching it, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't expected, something that confused and disturbed her in equal measure. She felt jealous. The confession came out like something she'd been holding for billions of years, this admission that she envied these simple, mindless things that could unthink or feel or know anything at all because they were in the world part of it, experiencing it from the inside instead of watching from outside. They could touch and be touched, could change and be changed, could participate in existence instead of just observing it. And even though being in a body meant limitation, meant experiencing only one small piece of reality at a time instead of perceiving the whole planet at once, even though it meant vulnerability and pain and eventual death, there was something about it that called to her, something that made the vast awareness she possessed feel somehow less real than the simple existence of a single cell dividing in the dark ocean. Time passed in great sweeping movements, as Elizabeth described, millions of years compressing into moments, life crawling from water to land, developing lungs and legs and nervous systems, growing more complex with each generation, each mutation, each extinction event that cleared the way for something new. The watchers observed all of it with the patience of beings who existed outside time, who had no bodies to age, no deaths to fear, no urgency driving them toward action. But something was changing among them, a question beginning to form that some found exciting and others found dangerous. They started to notice that life on this planet wasn't just surviving and reproducing like it did elsewhere in the universe. It was evolving toward something specific, something they recognized because it was what they were: consciousness, awareness, the ability to know that you know. And that's when some of the watchers started to wonder if they could do more than watch. Elizabeth described the debates that happened in that space beyond language, some arguing that their role was sacred observation, that getting involved would contaminate both themselves and the natural evolution of consciousness on Earth, that they needed to maintain their purity and distance and perspective. Others argued the opposite, said that consciousness experiencing itself from inside physical reality was the whole point of everything, that watching was just preparation, that they were meant to eventually incarnate, to take the leap from infinite awareness into finite form. Elizabeth found herself caught between these positions, seeing truth in both, unable to decide, paralyzed by the weight of a choice that felt both inevitable and impossible. What changed her mind was witnessing death for the first time. Not the death of simple organisms that had no awareness of their own ending, but the death of the first human who knew she was dying, who understood what it meant, who was afraid. Elizabeth's voice broke as she described this young woman, maybe 20 cycles of seasons old, lying on the ground with fever burning through her body, while her mate held her and her children cried and the whole tribe gathered to witness her leaving. But unlike the animals who simply faded when their bodies failed, this woman fought against it, conscious of every moment slipping away, terrified of the darkness she believed was coming, reaching for life with a desperation that came from knowing it was ending. Elizabeth had been as close as she could get, without having a body, hovering near, perceiving every sensation, the burning lungs, the weakening heartbeat, the fear flooding through a mind that understood its own mortality for the first time in the history of Earth. And she had tried to comfort this dying woman, tried to whisper that death wasn't an ending, that consciousness continued, that she would be okay. But the woman couldn't hear her. The pain was too loud, the fear too overwhelming. And all of Elizabeth's vast awareness, all her billions of years of observation, all her knowledge of the universe and consciousness and the eternal nature of souls, none of it mattered because she could unreach this one terrified human in the moment when comfort mattered most. That's when something broke in Elizabeth, broke in whatever watchers have that can break, shattered the careful distance she'd maintained for so long. She followed the woman's soul when it left the body, followed it to the place between where souls go after death, the place Elizabeth herself had come from, and watched as the woman realized she still existed, watched the terror transform into wonder, watched understanding dawn that death was just transition. And when the woman saw Elizabeth there, recognized her somehow as the presence that had tried to comfort her during dying, she asked a simple question that would echo through the next several thousand years. Why don't you try it? Being human, living instead of watching. Elizabeth had given all the standard answers about watchers needing to maintain observation, about incarnation being a limitation, about serving a higher purpose through distance and perspective. But the woman had looked at her with newly freed eyes and said something that cut through every justification Elizabeth had built over eons. She said, "That sounds lonely." And in that moment Elizabeth realized it was true, that she had been lonely for billions of years. So lonely she'd stopped noticing, surrounded by other watchers but never truly connected. observing love without experiencing it, watching humans build families and communities and civilizations based on the simple need to not be alone, never understanding what it cost to witness all that from outside. But knowing she was lonely wasn't enough to make her incarnate. Elizabeth continued watching for thousands of years more, watching humans develop language and art and music, watching them create beauty that made her weep without tears, watching them nurse strangers back to health and sacrifice themselves for others and reach for something higher than mere survival. But she also watched the violence, the wars, the cruelty that came from fear, the way they hurt each other over ideas and differences and resources. And she kept breaking the rules, kept whispering guidance, giving them fire and tools and agriculture, trying to help from her place outside reality. But every time she helped them solve one problem, they created two more. And she began to understand something the other watchers didn't want to accept. Humanity's biggest problem wasn't lack of knowledge or resources or capability. It was lack of wisdom. And wisdom couldn't be taught from outside, couldn't be whispered in dreams, couldn't be handed down like instructions for making fire. Wisdom could only be learned through experience, through making mistakes and feeling the consequences, through hurting and being hurt and having to find a way forward anyway, through living in a body with all its vulnerabilities and discovering what it means to be mortal and still choose love over fear, connection over isolation, hope over despair. No amount of watching could teach her that. No amount of observation could give her the understanding that came from being inside the struggle instead of above it. The final breaking point came in 1945, in July, when Elizabeth watched humans split the atom in a desert in New Mexico. She watched them create a weapon that could end not just individual lives or cities or even civilizations, but all life, that could undo billions of years of evolution in seconds, that could make the earth lifeless again, silent again, empty of the consciousness it had worked so hard to create. And for the first time in her entire existence, Elizabeth felt real terror, existential terror, the kind that came from believing that everything might actually end, that all the beauty and struggle and growth and learning might be erased, that the whole experiment might fail before it reached whatever conclusion it was reaching toward. She could have stayed outside, could have kept watching from her safe distance, could have maintained her purity and perspective while humanity either saved itself or destroyed itself. But she realized that she loved them, these broken, beautiful creatures who kept reaching for light even when darkness surrounded them, who kept choosing connection even after betrayal, who kept creating beauty even in the shadow of destruction. And love that doesn't risk anything, that stays safe and distant and uninvolved, isn't really love at all. So she started looking for a way in, watching for the right opening, the right soul contract, the right moment to finally stop watching and start being. She found it in 1952, in a young woman barely 23 years old, pregnant with her first child, terrified of bringing new life into a world that had just discovered it could destroy itself. This woman was praying, asking for help, for guidance, for some sign that it would be okay to bring a child into this dangerous world. And Elizabeth whispered to her, not instructions this time, not guidance or warnings, but an offer. Let me come with you. Let me share this lifetime. Let me help carry what you're carrying. Let me experience what it means to be human instead of just watching humans be after. And the woman, desperate and scared and hoping for exactly this kind of help, said yes. That woman was Elizabeth's mother. And when Elizabeth finally incarnated after billions of years of formless observation, everything changed in ways she hadn't fully understood would happen. The infinite awareness compressed into a tiny body, all that vast perception narrowed down to 5 simple senses, all that timeless existence suddenly bound by hours and days and years that marched relentlessly toward an ending. The connection to other watchers severed completely, replaced by the overwhelming isolation of being one separate individual trapped in flesh that would age and sicken and die. And worst of all, she forgot. That's what incarnation does. It makes you forget what you were before. Makes you forget the vastness and the knowing and the eternal nature of your own consciousness. Makes you believe that the body and the life and the limitations are all there is. For decades, Elizabeth lived as a human, with no conscious memory of being anything else. Just this vague sense of wrongness, of not belonging, of being homesick for a place she couldn't name. The anxiety attacks started in her 20s. This feeling of not being able to breathe, of the world being too small, of being trapped in something that didn't fit right. Doctors called it generalized anxiety disorder, gave her medications that dulled the symptoms but never touched the real source. Because the source wasn't chemical imbalance, or childhood trauma, or any of the usual explanations. The source was her soul remembering without consciously remembering. Some part of her knowing she had once been infinite and was now contained in this fragile, temporary form. She came to Dr. Chun's office, expecting to find some traumatic past life that would explain her anxiety. Maybe a drowning, or a fire, or a violent death that her subconscious was still carrying. She had not expected to remember being a watcher, to remember billions of years of observation, to remember the moment she chose to incarnate and why. And now, lying in this chair with tears streaming down her face, she finally understood what her anxiety had been trying to tell her all along. It wasn't a disorder. It was homesickness. It was her soul mourning the loss of infinite perception. It was the part of her that remembered being everything, feeling trapped in being one small thing. Dr. Chen asked her softly if she regretted it, regretted becoming human after all those eons of watching. Elizabeth was quiet for a long time, and when she finally answered, her voice carried both grief and wonder in equal measure. On her good days, she said, being human was the most beautiful thing she'd ever experienced. Love in a body was different than observing love. Music sounded different when you had ears. Food tasted like proof that the universe wanted consciousness to feel pleasure. The simple act of holding someone's hand created connection in a way that billions of years of watching connection never could. On those days, she understood why souls lined up to incarnate, why they chose limitation over infinity, why they agreed to forget their vastness to experience this small, precious, temporary thing called a human life. But on her bad days, Elizabeth wanted to go back, wanted to be formless again, to watch without feeling, to see the wars and cruelty and stupidity from a distance where it didn't hurt so much, because being human meant feeling everything, meant the pain cut deeper, and the fear loomed larger, and the grief of impermanence shadowed even the happiest moments. It meant knowing everyone you loved would die, that everything you built would crumble, that even your own consciousness would eventually have to leave this body and start over somewhere else with no memory of who you'd been or what you'd learned. On those days, the weight of being human felt unbearable, felt like a mistake she couldn't undo, felt like a prison she'd walked into willingly but couldn't find her way out of. Dr. Chen suggested something that made Elizabeth open her eyes, made her look directly at the therapist with an expression of surprise and recognition. What if that's exactly what you came to learn? How to be whole while feeling separate. How to remember connection while living in a body that feels isolated. How to hold both truths at once, the infinite and the finite, the eternal and the temporary, the vast awareness you were and the small human you are. What if the anxiety wasn't a problem to be fixed, but a bridge between those two states, a reminder that you read both things simultaneously, that incarnation doesn't erase what you were, but adds to it, expands it, gives it dimension it never had before. Elizabeth sat with that for a long time after the session ended, sat in silence while Dr. Chen waited patiently, not rushing, not pushing, just holding space for whatever needed to emerge. And finally, Elizabeth spoke, her voice clearer than it had been all session. She said she'd come here thinking something was wrong with her, thinking she was broken and needed to be fixed. But now she understood that maybe she was exactly what she was supposed to be, uncomfortable, out of place, remembering things she wasn't supposed to remember, carrying an ancient awareness in a modern body, bridging the gap between watching and being. The panic attacks didn't stop immediately after that session, but something shifted in how Elizabeth related to them. 3 days later, she called Dr. Chun to say that the anxiety was still there, but it felt different now, felt less like drowning, and more like homesickness, less like pathology, and more like her soul's honest response to being in a world that could uncontain all of what she was. And recognizing that, naming it, understanding it, somehow made it bearable in a way medication and therapy never had, because it wasn't something wrong with her brain chemistry. It was something true about the nature of consciousness in a body. About what it costs to incarnate, about the price of choosing to be human when you remember being infinite. Elizabeth started meditating after that, not to get rid of the anxiety but to sit with it, to listen to what it was trying to tell her, to honor the part of her that remembered watching Earth be born and now had to live on Earth as one small temporary creature among billions. And what her anxiety told her was simple and difficult and exactly what she needed to hear. You chose this. You chose to stop watching and start being. You chose limitation because you loved them, so stop trying to escape it. Stop trying to watch from a distance. Be here, all the way, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. 6 months later, Elizabeth started teaching. Not regression therapy or past life work, but something simpler and somehow more profound. She taught people how to sit with discomfort, how to feel without trying to fix, how to remember they're connected to everything even when the illusion of separation feels overwhelming. She never told her students about being a watcher, about billions of years of observation, about choosing to incarnate when she saw the atomic bomb. She didn't need to. They felt it anyway, felt something old in her, something that had seen more than one lifetime could hold, something that carried wisdom earned, not just through living but through watching countless others live and die and struggle and grow. Dr. Chun kept the recording of that session and listened to it hundreds of times, and every time she heard something new, some layer she'd missed before, some truth hiding in Elizabeth's words that only revealed itself on the 5th or 10th or 20th listening. Because that's the thing about stories like this, about regressions that go beyond past lives into something stranger and deeper and more true. They're not just about one person's experience, they're about all of us. Every soul that chose to incarnate, every consciousness that agreed to forget its infinite nature to experience limitation. Every human who's ever felt like they don't belong here, like they're homesick for a place that doesn't exist in physical reality, like they're carrying something too big for one body to hold. You don't belong here because you remember something bigger. You remember before bathas, before separation, before the forgetting that makes incarnation possible, and that memory lives in your anxiety, your restlessness, your sense that something's missing even when you have everything you thought you wanted. It's not missing. You read just homesick for a place you can only reach by going through this life. Fully, not around it or above it or in careful observation of it, but through it, into it, all the way down into the messy, beautiful, terrible experience of being human with all its limitations and all its gifts. Elizabeth is 72 years old now. She still has hard days when the weight of being human feels like too much, when she wants to shed her skin and return to formless watching, when the pain and fear and grief of this world make her question why she ever chose to incarnate at all. But she stays, not because she's trapped, but because she made a promise. Not to the Watchers or the universe or some higher power, but to that young mother in 1952 who was terrified of bringing a child into a dangerous world. She promised to help. And helping doesn't mean fixing or saving or making everything okay. It means showing up again and again in a body with all the pain and beauty and confusion that comes with it. That's what it means to be an old soul in a young world. You remember what we're supposed to become, even if you can't always explain how you know. You carry wisdom earned over lifetimes and eons, even if most days you can't access it consciously. You feel the connection between all beings even when everything in modern life tells you re-separate and alone. And you re-hear not to watch anymore but to be human with the rest of us, to feel what we feel, to struggle how we struggle, to love despite knowing loss is inevitable, to create beauty, knowing it's temporary, to choose hope even when hope seems foolish. Because that's what Elizabeth learned. That's what all old souls eventually learn. We didn't come here to fix humanity from outside. We came here to be human alongside everyone else, to participate in the grand, messy experiment of consciousness experiencing itself in flesh. Some souls chose this, knowing exactly what it would cost. Chose the forgetting so they could experience the remembering. Chose limitations so they could understand freedom. Chose separation so they could discover what it means to come home. If Elizabeth's story felt familiar, if something in it resonated with your own unexplainable anxiety or homesickness or sense of being too old for your body, there are others, more souls who watched before they incarnated, more beings who broke the rules because they loved too much to stay distant, more consciousness choosing to experience what it had only observed. The next one starts now.